everyone. I want to first thank you for inviting me to this talk, for SFU for hosting me as a visiting professor in sociology for the next few weeks, and for the kind of introductions and for the land acknowledgement as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing, but I'll just share my screen because I've got a few slides, not a whole lot of them, but I think that they will be useful. Okay. Okay. And if you can see on the screen here, on the bottom right is a rendering of a fat body by Fat Mystic, who is a body liberation artist in California. And at the top right, Jude Martin, who's a UK-based artist, has an empowerment series. And this is where these two pieces come from. So this work that I'm going to talk about today is something that I've been working on in relation to my scholarship around critical health studies in particular. And I sort of started to move towards that studies in terms of my disciplinary focus very recently, although it's sort of been omnipresent in my research around health. And critical feminist studies and intersectional approaches to health as well. So this idea of health being something that's socially constructed, what does it look like? Who defines it? How is it embedded into institutions? And what I've started to do, and I looked at some things that were happening in the media, and this whole discussion of Ozempic was really bringing up a lot of critical discussions of bodies and health and what bodies are good bodies and how it relates to citizenship and sort of normative beauty standards and femininity. And so I was looking a lot at that particular case study and then thinking about how critical interpretations from the left left a lot to be desired in terms of how fat bodies are understood. The tendency is to focus on a critique of capitalism, which is useful and good, but it doesn't quite get to what constitutes fat stigma and how it's experienced in practice. And so this is a sort of an example of me walking through and thinking through a lot of these issues. And I focus on the work of fat scholar Kat Pausé, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, and also Lauren Berlant, because I think her approach to fatness from a left critique is really emblematic of the discussions that are happening there. So I'll start just talking about how in 2023, in particular, I think, there was quite a big and marked change in how fatness has been understood and talked about in the media. And so the instigators that I sort of looked at, and I've looked at number one in past work, so the rise of anti-fat stigma that has followed medical, public, and political discourses around COVID-19. I think those ones, particularly in the UK, were very pronounced. And then also the popularity of diabetic medications, often generically talked about as Ozempic, which results in weight loss. So this new phase follows two other discrete formations. The first has existed for quite a while, but gained public popularity in the early aughts. And that's the fat positive movement. So this idea of body positivity that was supposed to be intersectional, empowering, rigorous, different forms of knowledge production and research practice, collective action, that continues even now to challenge the medicalization of fatness and challenge fat stigma and challenge anti-fat bias. So people have been working on this for decades. The second is growing research and writing that blends affect and new materialism and political economy to confront the cultural stigmatization of fat bodies using a no-fault argument. It challenges the neoliberal responsibilization, wherein fatness is seen as the fault of the individual. that sort of, from the 80s, neoliberalism, it's all the individual. If you are of ill health, if you are fat, it is your problem, it is your decision, it's something that you need to take responsibility for. And the left started to shift away from that argument and to challenge it directly as being overtly neoliberal, and to instead take an approach where you have a social determinants approach, the social determinants of health, where it's if you are in ill health, it's not the responsibility of the individual, it's not the fault of the individual, but it is due to structural determinants. And so it's more, it was believed under this sort of framework that fatness and ill health, and those two are conflated, and that's something I'll come back to as being really problematic. Was a result of profit-driven food industries. You got, documentaries like Super Size Me, manipulative advertising, inaccessible healthcare and inadequate healthcare, stressful working conditions, insecure housing, and formations of racism, ableism, gender bias, queerphobia, and a whole host of other intersecting marginalizations. Fatness often, and here I'm using fatness as a descriptor that's neutral, and it's actually the term that's chosen by the fat community to use rather than something like obesity, which is medicalizing. But I go back and forth depending on what the literature uses. It's understood as, so fatness is understood as a state that is de facto unhealthy, requiring redress by increasing economic redistribution, social support, and state regulation of capitalism. So on the left, the argument is that, okay, we don't want to fall into the sort of neoliberal capitalist critique of fatness, but what we'll do is say that fatness equals ill health, but the ill health is not the responsibility of the individual, it's the responsibility or the fault of all of these host of factors. This approach folds fatness in with other scourges of living in an exploitative neoliberal society, while also retaining, in common with fat justice models, the belief that discrimination against fat bodies is unjust. So it's saying that, it's not the responsibility of the individual, but it is something that is socially determined, but it's something that we then need to address with social change. But the underlying argument that fatness is a problem is still there. Laurent Berlant is one figure whose approach to fatness reflects this framework. And I argue in some of the work that I've done that needs to be looked at because it really is emblematic of the complexities of this argument. It's not just a social determinants argument. It's an anti-capitalist argument. It is a socialist argument, but it's one that has a fatal flaw in its battling of anti-fat stigma. It still relies on the assumption that fat bodies need to be changed. And this is how it relates to the weight loss drugs, which I'll come back to. So Laurent Berlant's work on fatness or obesity, and they use obesity specifically, is reflected in 4 pieces of writing. So they have some essays, Slow Death, Obesity, Sovereignty, Lateral Agency, Two Girls, Fat and Thin, Risky Business on Obesity, Eating, and the Ambiguity of Health, and America, Fat, the Fetus. I argue that in reading a lot of these pieces closely and alongside one another, it reveals a framework, a left socialist approach to fatness, wherein health is understood both as effectively felt and structurally determined. There's a lot of scholarship of note that takes up elements of Berlant's approach, but most do as part of other research or just tangentially, rather than fully engaging with this idea of fatness as structurally produced and embodied. While rich and capacious in its own right, what I argue is that Berlant's framework is undermined by several core factors, including an inability to push past the underlying assumption that fatness signifies an emotional pathology or physical illness, necessitating intervention. And that's sort of a big part of my argument is what is the science? How do we interpret the science? How does it relate to anti-fat stigma and really wanting to push past this idea that fatness is pathological either on the emotional level or that it is causally connected to physical illness. So I'm bringing together the various strands of Berlant's approach under the umbrella of a left socialist approach to fatness and critically analyzing their distinct and complex contributions. I think that this is a really underrated part of intellectual labor, this idea of description and reflective knowledge production. And I think that this, describing is a really important part of learning. And I propose a framework that retains the criticality of Berlant's approach and then supplement it with the work of fat scholars like Kat Pazé, whose contributions have not only cultivated a space for non-normative bodies and subjectivities to flourish, but has also made space for an understanding of fat bodies as good bodies. For critical fat scholars, health is understood as something that is granular, that's a process, that is constructed, that doesn't focus on ideal weight. The health at every size movement is one example of this reconceptualization. And I conclude sort of with a little bit of a discussion about what this means in our contemporary environment in terms of the weight loss drugs and the new challenges that are being brought to the fore and how we relate to our bodies and relate to well-being. So the understanding of fatness in Berlant's texts exists in a kind of liminal space. It's not quite anti-fat, but it's not quite justice forward. The discussion of fatness encapsulated by Berlant reflects aspects of where I fear our understanding of fatness might superficially slide back to, namely to a framework that doubles down on the attribution of ill health to fatness. Overall, Berlant's approach consists of a complicated assemblage of observations, theoretical critique, materialist analysis, and literary criticism. It's the material critique I'm most interested in, and I really want to focus on the left critical socialist lens, and then argue that if we take that critical sort of nugget and supplement it with contemporary fat justice scholarship, you would have an agenda, research agenda, critical agenda in which really addresses the dangerous rhetoric and policies that are emerging from contemporary conversations around fatness. And material critique is helpful, but only if the causal connection between fatness and ill health is severed. And I argue that that is sort of the fatal flaw. So in Slow Death, Berlant ties the so-called obesity epidemic, and they use the term obesity, to the wearing out of a population because of labor conditions and a life under capitalism, which they maintain is tied to the biopolitical administration of life and undergirded by a desire for a kind of sovereignty that is perpetually deferred. So they equate obesity with slow death. And they argue that obesity is sort of the condition that is the result of capitalist exploitation. So it's a shaming sickness of sovereignty, a predicament of privilege and of poverty, a crisis of choosing and anti-will. And that's a quote from Berlant. Obesity is thus bound to the destruction of the body and the non-human life world, wherein, quote, capitalist strategies negatively impact already vulnerable populations, which include people of color, children, and the aged, but more broadly too, the economically crunched. And so Berlant engages in this discourse and this critique of obesity and anti-fat stigma and marginalization, and brings in even an intersectional approach by looking at people who are elderly, people who are poor, people who are racialized, people who are who belong to sexually marginalized groups, and it does a good job of doing that. And it sort of is a very captivating approach and argument, and one that you're like, yeah, this is right. So Berlant ties obesity causally to overeating, and not unlike smoking, inextricably linked to behaviors that impact those who are racialized disproportionately. They argue that this is exacerbated by unequal access to healthcare, cramped conditions of everyday life, the unhealthy workplace. It's and this is a quote from them, "It's most notably the bodies of US working class and sub-proletarian populations that fray slowly from the pressure of obesity on their organs and skeletons." And so you get a very clear understanding of this left socialist approach. This connection between healthcare, labor, and health is an important part of Berlant's left socialist approach, since it draws attention to the core contradiction of fatness, specifically one that tests the neoliberal critique. The question that arises is whether fatness, or obesity as they sort of term it, is understood best alongside a critique of capitalism vis-a-vis health, or whether its subsumption into left critique and critical discourses risks permitting embodied, gendered, and racialized forms of stigma without adequate interrogation. Berlant does further on make the case that the aesthetic aversion to fat is a product of socially constructed preferences and norms. And so they do enter into that argument of aesthetics and of embodiment, and saying, what is it about the fat body and its intersections with race, class, history, which make it a body that's undesirable, that is seen as non-productive, unworthy of citizenship, and ties it, because this is being written sort of in the 80s, to, for example, fears of national weakness in the context of the Cold War, and then later on to 9/11, as it relates to maintaining fit and war-ready population. They then permit the obesity epidemic to be pathologized and medicalized and understood as the outcome of capitalist exploitation. So that fatness, obesity, is the destruction of bodies by capital, and that it requires correction. So that's another aspect, this idea that fat bodies are unhealthy bodies, fat bodies are bodies that need to be corrected. And Crawford, another scholar, echoes this interpretation in their article, Slender Trouble, From Berlant's Cruel Fighting of Figure to Sedgwick's Fat Presence, in which they challenge Berlant for their understanding of fat bodies as mobilizing a weak form of agency via food, and in doing so, undercutting the potentiality of that possibility. And this is just a quote from Crawford. "It is Berlant's failure to imagine how bodies big and small can attach and flourish, even while dying, via roots that are other than falsely conscious optimistic models of pure subjectivity or the accumulation of capital, via roots that do not remain stuck exclusively in traumatic pasts or impossible futures." Crawford turns to Eve Sedgwick for a more kind of capacious alternative, wherein fat bodies are seen as inherently and effectively present and self-sustaining, what he calls a queer reading of fat presence. This approach is laudable and can be used to buttress the work of fat studies scholars who are making similar arguments. Personalization, Berlant argues, or what we now would call responsibilization, is also critiqued as a conservative tactic meant to justify the gutting of the social safety net. So I think that's like another kernel or an insight that I would like to retain, this idea that by moving to a responsibilizing argument that you are at fault if you are in ill health is a way to gut the social safety net, or to justify doing that, and particularly healthcare. This critique of neoliberal decision-making reflects the intermission of healthist discourses, in which health is seen as one's personal responsibility, one that reinforces prevailing political ideology of neoliberalism and operates in a way as to facilitate the making of a good and healthy citizen, one that is productive, one that is laboring, one that is, sort of producing in this juggernaut. For Berlant, this is an inevitable outcome of capitalism, and thus in opposition to the left socialist critique they undertake in their work. Berlant also identifies that bodily comportment and health status, broadly defined, are a result of a multiplicity of factors, from genetics to the environment and stress, impact of the food industry, zoning, access to school programs, the manufactured exploitation of taste for salt, sugar, and fats. They identify these forces as that result in ill health, specifically when set within capitalist systems. Something that critical fat scholars agree with, minus the conflation of fatness with disease and pathology. Capitalism, instead, for fat scholars, is seen as intimately tied to racialized and gendered fat oppression. And this is often smoothed over by medical discourses that reflect a host of what Evans calls fat fabrications, where an adiposity is seen as a disease in and of itself. So body size, weight, fatness is seen as a proxy for health, and diet and physical activity is thought to unequivocally explain trends in obesity, regardless of other potential contributors. Thus, obesity or fatness appears to be categorized by Berlant under the same umbrella as cancer, heart disease, diabetes, or other diseases of quote unquote affluence. It is this link, I argue, that needs to be severed, and is severed by contemporary fat scholars, but which risks being reattached as a result of increasing access to interventions that result in rapid weight loss motivated by fat stigma, white supremacy, racism, and fat phobia. Despite this core oversight, I still think that Berlant's work on fatness and race remains significant and important to preserve. Another important point they make is that over the last 50 years, fatness has shifted from being assorted with the Southern, in the US context, poor white working class to the racialized Black population in ways that, quote, reinforce the image of African Americans as a population already saturated by death and available for mourning, compelled by appetites rather than strategies of sovereign agency towards class mobility. Berlant goes on to argue that the affixing of cultural pathologies to the Black population around food practices in particular gives rise to a papering over of the ways in which fatness for these groups is a direct outcome of, for instance, labor, schooling, and zoning that construct the endemic environment of the epidemic's emergence for Berlant. In making this case, Berlant draws attention to the destructiveness of rapacious capitalism and the impact of embedded racist stereotypes, which together have become inscribed on the bodies of already marginalized populations. While persuasive, Berlant is really taking for granted that fatness itself kills, or that it is at least entangled with a suite of comorbidities that do. However, they're clear that this is not a result of an individual failing, which is good. But I and scholars like Lebesco argue that yes, ill health is a product of structures and inequalities that are baked into our economic system. But shame and stigma is counterproductive and harmful, such that the slow death of being rolled out by neoliberal capitalism is deprived us of experiencing food as pleasurable, social, and comforting. Berlant argues in favor of extending forms of anarchist, cooperative, anti-capitalist, and anti-work experiments, which refuse the vampirism of profit extraction and that exhausts the body and saturates the infrastructure of even the most benign and impulsive everyday pleasures. The outcome of engaging in activities constituted by pleasures and sociality would challenge patriarchal and racialized structures that, for Berlant, have produced negative outcomes like obesity. Again, while Berlant's left critique of capitalist exploitation and control of laboring bodies is sound, what is taken for granted is that fatness is like a sort of a negative outcome of these forces, that it is inextricably linked to ill health, and that by attending to capitalism's structural distortions through everyday pleasures and structural change, obesity and ill health would be eliminated. And if we look at that from the context or the position of body diversity, this would be an eliminating a whole population. And what does that sort of mean in practice? And what does that mean ethically? I'm going to go over one other area in which Berlant talks about fatness, and it's an interesting one because it's done through their critical literary interpretation of a 1991 book called Two Girls, Fat and Thin by Mary Gateskill. And this is something I was really not used to in my research because I tend to stay away from sort of literary interpretations, sort of focus on more of the theoretical formations and the political economic critiques. But this argument sort of drew me in, and I think that it is just as illuminating as some of Berlant's more essay type work. So Berlant seems to backtrack somewhat on her environmental argument in this piece vis-a-vis fatness in pursuit of approach that is more psychological. And that's the other dimension that I think is really problematic in the left approach and needs to be addressed. In keeping with the belief that internal trauma and social disconnection, in addition to capitalism, leads to overeating as a coping strategy, which is the result of which is fatness. And that is something that is that you see also a lot of feminist scholarship on bodies as well, and it doesn't quite get to attending to fat stigma and the causes of it. I contend it's problematic because it risks sliding into forms of healthism and responsibilization, in which by elevating health to a super value, a metaphor for all that is good in life, we end up reinforcing the privatization of those struggles for well-being. Gaitskill's book follows the relationship between two young women, one who's fat, Dorothy, and one who's thin, Justine, as they move through life in search of an existence filled with social mobility, romance, normalcy, and belonging. The force of cruel optimism, insofar as the realization of these dreams appear impossible, leads Justine to shrink into herself and Dorothy to make herself, quote, her body a grotesque shield, which neutralizes in those gatherings of the normally proportioned curiosity or attachment. Berlant draws from the text directly and then extrapolates to comment on how food and pleasure work through and with one another and explode norms and structures. They state that when eating provides a way to negotiate one's incoherence while not organizing a personality to compensate for it. This sounds suspiciously like the coping and shielding mechanisms written about in psychology, which connect trauma, both personal and social, to overeating and thus weight gain. So not only are we stigmatizing fat bodies for being fat and reading them as unhealthy, we're then also looking at fat bodies as psychologically pathological, as being traumatized, as being something that needs to be addressed and fixed. It's also reminiscent of Susie Orbach's work, in which fatness is seen as a boundary-making act, a way for women to, quote, express their separateness in space. More positively, however, Berlant does succeed in de-responsibilizing obesity here. So it's less of a moral failing. And by drawing attention to how ill health is an outcome of living in a social world that requires deliberate and painful grasping for forms of consumption that feel liberating, creative, and pleasurable. Significantly in the book, Dorothy's fatness falls away when she joins this sort of like cult community and meets a man who makes her feel desired, which releases her from the, quote, compensatory body she developed as a ballast against annihilation. That the congealed form of history that hurts, as though it were indeed true that the body remembers everything. The loss of fat reveals a new Dorothy. She begins to shop, to cultivate her now striking looks, and to fall in love with a musculature she hasn't seen since she was 15 and struggling. She also begins to have sexual feelings. So this idea of sexual fulfillment, of enjoyment, of living the good life with a smaller body, and that being a precondition for doing those things, is expressed through this work. This is important to mention of Berlant's understanding of fatness, in that it speaks directly to the tendency to psychologize fatness as a product of an unaddressed lack, whether in the form of intimacy, sociality, love, or friendship. This premise is left unchallenged and conflicts with Berlant's more structural critique, since it defaults to thinness as the desired instantiation of normalcy and contentment. The cruelly utopian desire for and pressure to conform to white middle-class femininity represents another outcome of neoliberal capitalism and results in Justine and Dorothy's personal isolation. Conceptions of embodied fatness as anything but a negative outcome of trauma, of destructive capitalism, is troubling, and it returns to critiques of scholars like Orbach, who I would argue risks adhering to the social constructions of the fat body as a problem to be solved, and the cultural tendency to equate the fat body with conflict and disorder and fold in the fat body with the traumatized body. Berlant closes by arguing for the realization of deferred forms of visioning and enactment that would allow both characters and us to move through negation and self-annihilation towards embodied pleasure, meaning, and sound through creative production. So that's one of the, that we can work through all of this through creative production in order to unsettle what's personal and impersonal about being and having a history. While these forms of world building and creative practice are important, I would argue that it doesn't, and that Berlant doesn't sort of push forward towards an understanding of embodied fatness as more than the representation of a pathology, whether it's in the form of personal trauma or sociogenic capitalist exploitation. So taken together, these two pieces on obesity and slow death provide Two Girls, Fat and Thin, provide a psychosocial and structural left socialist means of understanding fatness that contains important insights with respect to how we might understand the role of biomedical technologies like that of Ozempic in the context of health justice and rising fat stigma, namely as a gendered and racialized consequence of capitalism, social neglect, austerity, and exploitation, and that's the social determinants of health argument that Berlant has, coupled with a left materialist critique of capitalism, and then the manipulation of biology by corporations who simultaneously push diets and weight loss surgeries and medicines, while also engineering foods that are concocted to encourage food consumption for profit. And then 3, compensatory mechanism aimed at dealing with oppressive social expectations, cultural codes, and individual happiness that arise out of cruelly optimistic expectations that surround suburban life. And I would say that this capitalist critique is important and salient as it relates to illness and obviating arguments about impaired or failed will. It does not get at the roots of fat stigma by addressing the causality thesis or challenging the notion that fatness as an identity is inherently flawed. I'm also critical as a scholar of monopolistic agribusiness and food companies that fail to account for their questionable business practices and voracious marketing to a stressed and overworked public vulnerable to new diets, procedures, and gamified foodstuffs. The medicalization of fatness, which undergirds the left socialist political economic critique, understands fatness as something to be intervened upon and solved, whether through self-discipline or participation in the industrial health economy. Not only is it counterproductive, leading to things like yo-yo dieting, weight cycling, and waste, but it depoliticizes fat subjectivity. Neither approach allows for fatness to be seen as embodied, desirable, or as Coring argues, of the fat Black body in particular, to be seen as a marginalized form of embodiment that should be reclaimed as a source of pleasure and abundance. Again, direct causality of illness and fatness and mortality has not been established. And if that occurs in the future, it needs to be disentangled from political economic critique of big agribusiness and corporate dominance of the health industry. So it's to construct its conflation with responsibility, choice, and agency, which asserts that it's incumbent on us to resist these forces. I'm even less sympathetic to the protective cocoon thesis, wherein fatness is seen as a compensatory mechanism to deal with trauma or unhappiness. The psychologizing echoes research suggesting that fatness is a symptom of an underlying set of conditions that are psychological, or to things like misogyny, gender injustice, and sexual violence. Susie Orbach's work, again, returning to that, frames fatness as the inevitable outcome of patriarchy, wherein women take material action, whether consciously or unconsciously, to resist the male gaze by rejecting beauty norms via binge eating and weight gain. It is accepted by Orbach and others that fatness is an undesirable state, and that is the problem I keep on coming back to, one that the individual actor is ultimately in control of and can mitigate by transforming their relationship with food through individual analysis and consciousness raising. This latter dimension is an oft forgotten facet of diet culture, wherein perceived ignorance is used to sell expertise in counterproductive ways. It's important to emphasize that reflected in each of these arguments, fat is compensatory as a way to avert the male gaze, as requiring external expertise to combat. The default condition is thinness, and the result is anti-fat stigma, and that's the sort of outcome. Some of these arguments reflect the times, sort of the mid to late aughts, during which Berlant wrote about obesity, slow death, and published her examinations of Gaitskill's novel. I'm not a fan of using the historical myopia argument to justify problematic past positions, because fat justice has been something that's been around for decades, and it's something that Berlant would have had access to. It is the case that the left political, economic, structural, and socialist understanding of fatness was lacking. What I find most useful in Berlant's approach, and I think it's essential to understanding how we might think about our current situation, is one, the particular way in which they delegitimize the idea of sovereign agency. So anticipating things like feminist, more new materialism and kind of more relational philosophy, how they demonstrate that social determinants are the most significant factors that determine one's health. So healthcare, living wage, education, the ordinariness under which the forces of gender and racialized capitalist exploitation wears out bodies that experience a form of slow death, and the role of corporate actors in creating harmful food ecosystems, which rather than facilitating commensality, abundance, health, and sociality, reproduces deprivation and inaccessibility. Berlant laudably tries to hold that fatness or obesity is genetic, socially determined, racialized, gendered, a site of revolt, and harmful when stigmatized, while also failing to interrogate the taken for granted causal relationship between fatness and ill health, fatness and trauma, and the embodied, entrenched, and harmful ways in which anti-fat bias is perpetuated in everyday life. Dorothy, in that story, her fatness in particular is assumed to be tied to her individual trauma and unhappiness, and food is seen as equivalent to drugs or alcohol, as a form of homeopathic aggression or culinary self-consolation, and those are quotes from Berlant. While this is in the text, Berlant's examination takes these assumptions for granted and permits the healthist dogma of calories in, calories out that dominates diet culture to continue to further pathologize individual fat bodies as wounded and whose lack is ascribed on their bodies. Now, there are two other pieces that I'm not going to go over, which I sort of write about, that Berlant takes up these arguments, but I think what I'm going to do just for time is shift over to fat studies scholars and what I think that fat studies scholars can contribute to this debate and argument, and in severing the link between fat bodies and disease, fat bodies and pathologizing. Fat studies scholars have built on the underlying presupposition that fat bodies are worthy, desiring, and desirous bodies, and that fatness is lived and enmeshed subjectivity, whose genesis, however it happens, by genetics, the environment, consumption, indulgence, pleasure, coping, however it happens, cannot and should not negate or condition their value. And that shifting to an idea of body diversity, just an idea that some bodies are bigger than others, and that's just the way it is a better way to think about fatness. This allows for focus to be redirected to the materiality and meaning of the body and its messy processes. And by decentering medical definitions of obesity, to debate more rigorously how body spaces are socially constructed and experienced, and not just biologically determined. And this is something that Kat Pazé talks about. Thinking more closely about how society has benefited from the marginalization of fat people is key, particularly when understood in terms of how it aligns with other forms of sorting and discipline, including race, gender, sexuality, and disability. The socially and corporally embodied and identity-forward theorizing can be found in Kapazé's work on fat standpoint theory and fat autoethnography, through which the personal is used to forefront how multiply marginalized fat subjects produce their own self-knowledge. This knowledge, she argues, challenges medicalized knowledge and discourses of victimization and uncontrollability. By crafting positive fat identities, creating fat positive spaces, embodying our fat bodies in the ways we want is fat agency, is fat resistance. It is this crystallization and mobilization of socially enmeshed fat identity that Berlant is missing. Although they do come close in one of the pieces that I couldn't go over, America, Fat, the Fetus. There's even some autoethnographic and non-identarian fat identity theorizing that piece in pieces such as where Berlant expresses, quote, "When I first imagined this essay, I thought I would have to write something about my own relation to fat, thinking my readers would wonder, is she fat? Since the paper's first incarnation was a talk, this anxiety faded. The audience had ocular evidence," close quote. So in terms of ways forward, in reading Berlant's work and thinking about this left socialist critique of fatness, what it offers, what it leaves to be desired, how it can be supplemented, I was moved by the connection Berlant makes between capitalism and slow death, while also feeling challenged by their stuckness to discourses of obesity. I began thinking about whether there was a way to preserve the radicalness of Berlant's left socialist critique, while also disentangling fatness from ill health, the deficit model, and trauma. Scholarship emerging out of fat studies, out of some areas in fat studies, offers a way to move forward by challenging the taken for granted assumption that only slim bodies are good bodies, that being fat is inherently unhealthy, and that fat people are undeserving of rights and dignity, which I think all of the conversations around Ozempic sort of draws more attention to. The literature challenging the causal connection between fatness and ill health, fatness and unproductiveness, and BMI as an accurate marker of wellness is vast. There's a lot of literature and research on this. And while I can't really go through it here, I do want to underline the complexities of disease and the multiple pathways through which conditions like diabetes and heart disease, which is often conflated with fatness as a physical state, are determined. As Wright argues, the conflation of overweight and the inaccuracy of BMI as a marker of ill health and bodily status, and the persistence of the couch potato trope, wherein fatness is equated with laziness, betrays a more insidious moral panic around fat bodies with dire consequences for those bodies who fail to conform. What results is the neoliberalization of health, wherein health is located exclusively or even primarily within the realm of personal responsibility in ways that obfuscate myriad social, structural, and institutional factors that contribute to health and illness in powerful and complex ways, ranging from things like class, gender, and ethnicity, to access to information, resources, healthcare, where health is seen as a personal responsibility. It also deflects consideration of the roles of institutions in addressing those material and social considerations. From this, the question that emerges is whether there's a way to preserve the socialist and materialist insights that Berlant offers, stripped of the biomedical medicalization and stigmatization of fatness by grounding what remains in a robust conception of fat subjectivity, humanity, and justice. And I argue that, sort of to close us out, this requires a framework that centers a robust understanding of fat subjectivity as a socially enmeshed subject position, one that is not pathologizing or rooted in trauma narratives, and concretizes the way in which ill health and capitalist-induced hyperconsumption results in bodily weathering and slow death, where slow death survives and persists because capital has become the gauge of value. And that's something that Berlant argues. And this would be done by, and you would want to kind of move away from things like a rhetoric of thinness or hegemonic femininity that has become quite oppressive. So I propose a mosaic approach, one that repudiates neoliberal responsibilization and instead acknowledges, one, the environment and social determinants of ill health, which Berlant does. Also notes the responsibility of mediated dis and misinformation in fostering health myths and hegemonic body norms. And also bringing to the fore the political economic role of big pharma, agribusiness, and pharmaceutical corporations in creating this system of health and food apartheid. All three are really important, and Berlant does articulate all of them in their work, and this remains critical in understanding and theorizing the co-constitution of health and capitalism. What we need is to take these three principles a step forward and to disentangle fatness from disease, trauma, and abjection. It's possible to hold this aspiration while still acknowledging that partial responsibility for ill health, inclusive of diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease, does lie with the privatized and highly processed foodstuff corporations and distribution and consumption and manufacture as well. This, however, needs to be distinguished from causal arguments around obesity. One should be able to embody fatness, identify as fat, engage in life as a fat person without being judged as unhealthy, unworthy, or unhappy, since the former's causal relation to fatness is under-evidenced, and in any event does not justify stigmatization. Scholars like Pazé offer a way forward by reframing fatness as an embodied identity that can be drawn into a critique of our contemporary ill health producing ecosystem. Fat justice in medical contexts in terms of accessibility, but also respect in medical contexts is important so that fat individuals get the care they need. And also non-discrimination in the workplace and media and wider society. So Shorb, another scholar, calls this the right to be fat, pointing out that what undoubtedly endangers health more than anything is social inequality and marginalization. Understanding and parsing the rise of Ozempic through this lens draws out and lays bare how even the most seemingly progressive critique, as demonstrated by Berlant's left socialist approach, leaves much to be desired. So in just a concluding thought, the understanding of Ozempic solely as a technology instead of practices whose use is linked to the political economy of privatized health provision, corporatization, personal trauma, and slow death reproduces a malaise rooted in the cruel optimism of sociogenic, racialized, and gendered body norms. This does not get to the fundamental nature of fat stigma or health as a desirous state. What is lacking is a robust theorization of fat justice that reflects how fat stigma is rooted fundamentally in the denial of embodied fat subjectivity. Also important is a further fleshing out of how anti-fatness is co-constituted with and by white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, racism, cis heteropatriarchy, and ableism. Fat studies, which, when combined with the destigmatizing use of Berlant's left socialist approach to obesity, offers a way forward. A vigorous analysis of Ozempic as a technocultural phenomena would begin by engaging with the imbrication of corporate power, marketing, hyperconsumerism, capitalism's tendency to invoke and ascribe effective hypervigilance, unreliable agency, also the race and class and gendered reproduction of ill health is another consequence of this system. Fatness or obesity is not. The popularity of these drugs also speak to the fragility and cruel optimism of the body positivity movement, which Rachel Pick in her article in The Guardian averse has now become, quote, a watered-down version of an older and more radical fat activist movement. Its ideas repackaged for mass consumption by advertisers and marketers. The hype and use surrounding Ozempic as a way to perform and fit into normative body expectations is of particular concern for what it says about the endemic anti-fatness of contemporary society. It is this point, as I've argued, that needs to be addressed. Combining Berland's approach with critical fat scholarship offers a way to think closely about structural fat stigma and fat bias through a multi-perspectival lens by drawing together critical political economy with a robust conception of fat justice. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.